Genesis 7, just have your Bibles turned there, and we'll just sort of comment as we go. But what you should see right at the outset is that clean and unclean animals are the type animals Noah brings on his boat. Does that seem odd to you? Yeah, the law is not yet. Okay? So, should we be, did the narrator jump the gun here? Is he expecting us to read it with Leviticus in mind? Or is there something that has come so far in Genesis that should have tipped our head towards clean and unclean? Okay. Well, then you wouldn't think there'd be anything clean. Abel's sacrifice, okay, that's something we have to work with. Very good. Excellent. Okay. Yes, I would say it's a mixture between the fact that the serpent was made to go lower on the ground. We didn't spend a lot of time on that, but he became more closely associated with the ground, okay? And then you have an acceptable sacrifice with Abel. So those are just two things, and I don't think the narrator introduces something that you're not prepared for. So we should have somewhere to say, okay, I had an idea this was coming. Just like the Numbers 5 ritual. If you read that ritual as totally disconnected to what has come before, I think you're reading it wrongly. In the Numbers 5 ritual, we looked at Eve's adultery, the flood's adultery, and we'll see, Lord willing, tomorrow, Exodus 32's adultery. All of that's before Numbers 5, test of adultery. So the narrator prepares you for what you're going to encounter. So anytime you see something that shocks you, you should say, what is this about? Why is that like that? Okay. So I think these are the things we need to work off of. Okay, so we've got clean and we've got unclean, and what we know so far is that clean and unclean, let's say this, the more unclean you are is the more deeply you're associated with the dust. Okay, that's what we know for certain. And we know that of the flock can be acceptable. We know that. And now we're starting to have categories for clean and unclean, so that when he says there's clean and unclean, we should say what is clean, what's not clean. And you're beginning to understand that which is unclean has deep association with the earth and with death. And that'll become really clear when we get to the animals that are unclean. They have deep association with the earth and with death. Because we know dust is death, because Adam's going to return to dust. And we know that it's earth because the serpent went closer to the earth. Okay. All right, next. There's numbers in the flood narrative that are significant numbers, okay? We'll find that rest is being pursued big time in the flood. Lamech, Noah's father, lived for 777 years. He fathered Noah at age 182, which is 26 times 7, and that means that he shares 77% of his life with Noah, okay? Noah's name means, it sounds like the word for rest. It's like a sigh, like, is Noah. And then we see that the term is used, and this is in chapter 8, but it says, the ark came to rest on Mount Sinai. All of these things are meant to be connected to day 7. That God is seeking to reestablish day 7 because humanity stopped living in day 7. How do we know they stopped living in day 7? Because and my argument with the angelic demon possession is they wanted power. They wanted to be the new Lamechs. And so they pursued this power that was in these Nephilim that became men of the name. But that is, I think that's what they're after. And so they pursued strength in their strength instead of rest in God's strength. And then the flood narrative speaks God speaks with Noah 7 times in the flood narrative. And this goes back to Lamech's being a man of 7. So these are all connections with the number 7. And before we go to decreation, there's connections with the number 40. It'll rain for 40 days and 40 nights. This is the first instance of the number 40. And so 40 becomes associated with new creation. Okay? So anytime you see the number 40, you should start thinking a new creation is afoot. A new creation is starting to happen. Where else do we see the number 40? Moses 2 times is on Mount Sinai, 40 days and 40 nights. Okay? That's a big deal. Before and after the golden calf. So a new creation needs to happen there. How many days did the spies search out the land? 40 days. A new creation is about to take place. And then when they refuse to go in the land, God takes that, just like if you refuse his rest, he punishes Israel with 7-fold judgment, right? That's like, it goes hand in hand. You refuse rest, so I'm going to punish you with 7-fold judgment. You refuse to go in the land after 40 days of spying, you'll be in the land for 40 years. So all those things are related. You refuse new creation, you'll be punished for the approximate time. And that's also goes into when you disobey the Lord, those who hate the Lord will be punished to the 3rd and 4th generation, which I think goes back to day 3 of creation, which is you need to be reborn. You need to be resurrected. The 3-year. Does that make sense? The number 3. Okay? And then 4 has to do with new creation and the number 40. Okay? Elijah goes in the strength of God after defeating the prophets of Baal for 40 days. Goliath gloats over Israel for 40 days before he's killed. So all of these things are new creation concepts when you see them. So keep an eye out for 40 days. Just imprint this on your mind. God doesn't say something for no reason. If he didn't want you to know how many days something happened and it wasn't consequential, he wouldn't have told you. Okay? So, notice these things. They're important. Very important. So, Christ continually has visibility on the Sabbath, which is the 7th day in the Gospels. Jesus is in the wilderness for how many days? 40 days. So a new creation is happening. How many days does he spend with his disciples after his resurrection? 40 days. So you see all these connections? You're meant to notice these things. Okay, decreation. We've already talked about God plunging the world back into its pre-creative state. It's like he dials back the calendar all the way to the beginning of Genesis with the flood, okay? And Noah is the new Adam, okay? And this is, it says that the water went to the nostrils. It obliterates life. And Jesus reverses this in that, do you remember that odd passage in John where he breathes on his disciples? It's like a new creation concept. Do you remember that? It's John 20, 22. So the air comes out of the nostrils in the flood, and Jesus breathes in life with his disciples. And then it says that God remembered. And this remembering takes place in chapter 8, but it's being built up all through chapter 7, okay? So, and Gordon Wenham, some of you guys have been asking me, authors to pursue. Gordon Wenham is an awesome Old Testament author to pursue. He's been a huge blessing to me, and he's the one that notice this chiasm. So you start with 7 days, and that's in 7:4. And then there's 7 days of waiting in 8:12. Okay. And then it goes to 7 in 7:10, another 7 days of waiting. And then down here, there's 7 days of waiting in 8:10. And then there's 40 days of the flood in 7:17a. And then there's 40 days of waiting for the waters to subside in 8:6. And then there's 150 days of the water triumphing, and that's in 7:24. And then there's 150 days where the water recedes in 8:3. And this leads to the central point of the chiasm, which is in 8:1, which is God remembered. Thank you. So you're meant to remember, you're meant to notice this God remembered in Genesis 8:1. It's all climaxing to this point. Okay? So that tells you that when God recalls something important, that's what's most important for us. So it's not what we think of ourselves that's most important. It's what God thinks of us that's most important. And so we find our worth, our value in what God thinks, not in what you think of you, or what you think of me, or I think of you. Paul says, listen, I don't care to the church, because everybody's after Paul. Paul just gets beat up all the time. He says, I don't care what you think of me. I don't care what I think of myself. What I care about is what God thinks of me. It's awesome. That's true freedom. And so this is the idea that with Christ, God thinks of us what he thinks of Jesus. And that's what matters. So however you feel about yourself, what's most important is what God thinks of you. And I had a conversation, I don't want to embarrass one of you guys, but I had a conversation with one of you earlier this week where, in thinking of the personality God gave us or the disposition God gave us, sometimes that's not always what we wish. That we can look at other people and think, man, I really wish that I could have more of that, or I could be more like that. But the person I was speaking with came to be very content with who God made them to be, and that their greatest contentment was in who Jesus is for them, more than what they want to be for themselves, And it was eyes on Christ. Stop thinking of self. Tim Keller said, he says, I can almost promise you that none of you have thought of your toes today. Like, not one single time did you think of your toes. Unless, now it could be possible, you may have thought of your toes. And if you thought of your toes, it's probably because something was wrong with one of your toes. And he said, that's what it's like with ourselves. You only are thinking about yourself. When you're preoccupied with yourself, that means something's wrong with yourself. The most healthy people don't notice themselves. Did David notice himself when he was exposing himself, dancing so wildly for the Lord? He said, I'll debase myself further for the Lord. He didn't notice himself. So when you find yourself being preoccupied with yourselves, you're like a stubbed toe that's not healthy. That's the only time you think of your toes. And so what's most important to us is the fact that God remembers us, that God thinks of us. That is where we're to be like, yes, that's where I'm going to pitch my tent. Okay? Okay, Israel, I've been waiting for you to come back very diligently so I could tell you. Numbers 13:33. Numbers 13:33. Going back to our Nephilim discussion. Numbers 13:33 says, and there we saw the Nephilim. This is the guys going to the promised land. The sons of Anak, who come from the Nephilim. And we seem to ourselves like grasshoppers, and so we seem to them. So that's just worth kicking around. That the Nephilim were in Noah's bloodline, otherwise they wouldn't be post-flood. So chew on that. Chew on that. And I'm not, I have my answer, but I could be wrong too. But chew on that. We can talk about it later. Okay. So he remembered. All right. We talked about the ark and Eden. We've already discussed that. And you guys brought up excellent points. It's built of trees, so it's floating trees. There's animals on it. And there was one other thing that, 3 levels. That's what I was looking at you at, Gem Cheese. Okay. Wait, guys, am I on the wrong one here? Yeah, how did that happen? Oh, it's just where I went back. Okay, new creation, Genesis 9. Rainbow, Noah's fall, faith. Okay. All right, so we've got the rainbow. Now, Asias brought up a good point in that the window's closed. Remember how we had our rainbow discussion? That the greater you're exposed to the glory of God, the quicker you die when you're not ready to be exposed to the glory of God. Okay? And so the firmament, that hard beaten out plate, collapses. You see into the glory of God, and your lives get shorter. Okay? And Asias brought up the point after class that the windows of heaven do close. Asias, I was looking at that, and here would be my answer to that. Okay, so Genesis 8:3, the fountains of the deep and the windows of heavens were closed. The rain from the heavens was restrained. So, there's something to be said for him hanging his bow in the sky. That actual word is not, it's a warrior's bow. Okay? So he chooses that word. He could have chosen something else, but he chooses a warrior's bow. So I'm not opposed to really chasing that symbol down. Okay? And it's as though God pierces the firmament. That's the window's opening. Okay? And then, people make a thing about the rainbow. Where is it pointing now? Up. At first I was like, oh, that's crazy. But I'm open to it. That the arrow's pointing at heaven now. In just a few chapters, God is going to walk through the beasts and put Moses to sleep. And that ritual was to say, if you fail on your side of it, you'll be cut in half like these beasts. So God is ready to start talking about him dying. Because God's going to die. God took that covenant ceremony. Abraham's asleep. He's essentially saying, if you fail on your side of the bargain, or I fail on my side of the bargain, I will die. That's what he's saying. I will take your punishment, and I will keep my end of it to give you blessing. He does both. And so God's comfortable talking about him dying. So why wouldn't he say the bow's pointed up? That's just my thing. I think there's something there. But all that to say that he restrains the water. There is still some sense of an atmosphere over us. Okay? So I would say whether the entire thing collapsed or he retained a thin layer of the watery atmosphere over the earth, that I still think it's the best explanation of lifespan shortening and you seeing the glory of God. So I would say that, is the firmament thinner or what? Or did a large portion of it fall? But that was a really good point. And you still have, the skies will be rolled up. It will be rolled up. So in some sense of it, there still is an atmosphere. And so that's where I'd head with that. That was a good thing to chase down, though, for me. Okay, so we've touched on that, and then we touch on the faith of Noah. Who can look up for me Hebrews 11:7? Okay, so we see that Noah, he acts in faith. This is the Passover where they put the blood over the door. This is an act of faith. This is them acting on the provision of God. Abraham will go up a mountain. God will provide a ram. That is his provision. And so God continually is giving provisionary salvations, which all are just like a snowball that gets bigger until it hits Christ. Does that make sense? These are provisionary sacrifices or provisionary actions. You'll see that the serpent is lifted up on the pole in Numbers 25 and 26, these passages. And Jesus will say, I'm like that serpent. These are all just little, like we had communion here, with a small piece of bread and a little cup of wine. And that is God's provision. That doesn't save us. It's looking at Jesus who saved us. The communion meal looks back. All of these look forward. Okay? They're just tastes. They're just little snippets of Jesus that's to come. Okay? All right, Genesis 10. This is a long chapter that shows the dividing of nations. This chapter is likely meant to prepare you to see what happened in Babel. So this is coming before Babel in chapter, but it's readying you for how it got here when it gets to Babel. Okay? So you're ready for the splitting of the nations that's to come in Babel. All right? But what's significant is that it's 70 nations. All right? And how many people at the end of Genesis go down to Egypt with Jacob? 70. And that's very significant because what is God doing? He's making a new nation, a new creation. These 70 people are going to replace 70 nations. Okay? And this also is pictured in Christ in the sense that this new man is going to remake all men. Okay? And obviously for those in Christ. Okay? All right. So we're moving, Genesis 11, we get to Babel. Okay? And so what we find is a distorted, a counterfeit creation, okay? Because you have language like the whole earth. The whole earth was together. They had one language. This sounds like Eden, where there's unity. But it's counterfeit in that Babel was built by people from the east. And I'm just remembering, I forgot to tell you. Which direction did Cain go from the garden? He went east. Now this is a people from the east. So anytime you see east in Genesis, you're meant to say, this can't be good. This cannot be good. Because they're moving away from God's house, not to it. Okay? And so there are people from the east, all right? So this is bad. You remember, what did God say to Adam he wanted to do with his image? You're supposed to multiply and fill the earth. Does that sound like staying in one location or spreading? Okay, and what are the people in Babel doing? Hey, let's stick together. Let's not spread out. So it's counter what God wants. You've got is Babel like Mount Eden? Babel is a built mountain, effectively. Okay? Its top is in the heavens, it says. And that's kind of tongue-in-cheek because God says when he looked at it, he had to look down from heaven. So it's like, it's not as high as they thought, as they thought it was. Okay, and then you'll see things like they'll say, let us make. What does that make you think of? Genesis 1, let us make man in our own image. So what you have is these people are supplanting God's creation. That's what's taking place. They're creating an entity by which they're to be known and make a name for themselves. Do you see all this make a name language? Lamech made a name for himself. Cain named a city after his son. The people in the flood were making a name for themselves in the Nephilim, the men of renown, the men of the name. So all of these people are lifting up a name for themselves that God is saying, no, there's only one name that should be lifted up. There's one name that's above every other name. But all these people are trying to lift up their name. And you'll find a huge thing as far as Exodus. Because what's Pharaoh doing? He's building a city for himself. And God will come and build a city for his name. So there's the two guiding questions of the book of Exodus are asked by Pharaoh and Moses. And they both ask nearly the same question. Moses asks it in Exodus 3, God, if I go to the people Israel, what should I tell them your name is? Then he goes to Pharaoh and he says, the Lord says to let your people go. And Pharaoh says, who is the Lord? The rest of Exodus answers both of those questions. Who is the Lord? You read the rest of this book and you'll find out who the Lord is. The rest of Exodus answers the first two questions at the beginning of the book. Moses asks it and Pharaoh asks it. And God spends the rest of the book sorting it out. This is what my name looks like. Okay? And so all of these people are desiring to make a Shem for themselves. That's very significant because who does the blessing go through in Noah's family? Shem. Because what is God making? A name. So Shem is the one that's blessed. Name. Noah, which one of your kids is blessed? Name. It's his name. That's what it means. Shem is name. Now these people are trying to build a Shem for themselves. So it's really important to see the interplay that's going on here between God and the world and what they're up to. So God sends essentially a waterless flood. He's already said, I'm not going to send a flood again to eliminate humanity. So instead, he scatters humanity, which is kind of funny because that's what they were supposed to be doing anyway. And they weren't. They were staying together. Okay? And so there's a comparison meant at the end of chapter 11. When you look at the genealogies, you notice little things like this, where Noah is 10th from the top in his genealogy, and Shem is 10th from the top in Abram's genealogy. So those are little narrative clues that the author is saying, Noah is like Shem. This is the guy I'm making a name out of. So those are the type things. Remember, he doesn't give you genealogies for nothing. They're there for a reason. We just got to figure it out, and it might take a while to figure it out. Okay, so then we jump into Genesis 12. Yeah. Well, so is there anything in the Genesis 1-3 narrative that this should remind us of? Anything in the Genesis 1-3 where you're kind of like, oh, that's an interesting statement by God. What are you thinking, Kim and Cheese? Very good, yeah. What is it? Hey, we need to bar them, lest they eat from the tree of life and live forever. Okay? So what are these statements of God? We tend to read them instantly with fear, that God's like afraid of humanity, okay? But we should know better than that. And so why would God do these things? Okay. I think my best answer to this is let's start with the Genesis 3. Okay. So let's say that there is a gas chamber, okay, that has poisonous gas that can be released. And God says, do not go in that chamber, because if you go in that chamber, you will become totally misshapen and ghastly in bodily form. It will mess you up. Don't go in that gas chamber. And Adam and Eve venture in the gas chamber, and the gas comes out. They press the wrong button, and the gas comes out. And they're starting to see what God said to take place. Okay? All right. In that misshapen, defunct form, would it be good for them to eat of the tree of life and live forever in that state? Would that be a loving action of God to have them live forever in that state? Or would it be loving for God to come behind them and shut the door and swing the wheel and say, okay, you now need to die and be reborn? I think it's that one. I think that God cuts them off from the tree of life because the best thing for them right now is to die and to be reborn. What does Paul call his body? What does he want to shed? This body of death. He's tired of it. He wants it gone, you know? And so I think that's the Genesis 3. That it's judgment. It is judgment, but it's also grace in that situation. And I would say that there's something similar at play in Genesis 11, where God is not, in his grace, he is not wanting man to succeed in his grace. Maybe you could look at a World War II situation where Hitler is having tremendous success, but is his success something that will be good for the world? No, it would be terrible for the world. And so I think there's a sense in which God is curbing their success for their benefit. That's my best. I see both of these as acts of judgment and acts of grace. That's my take on it. Any other questions? That's a really good one, though. Before we got to Genesis 12. Okay, let's jump to Genesis 12. I'm not sure why. Maybe I need to change that on my master copy. I'm not sure why they're all showing up at once. I think it must have been something I did when I made it. Okay, but let's talk about Genesis 12. What's the first thing God says to Abram? What have the people of Babel been doing? Gathering together and keeping as one. What's the first word he says to Abram? Go. So, you know what this is? This is like the second Great Commission. The first Great Commission is given to Adam and Eve to fill the earth and multiply. That's like the end of the Gospels. Go into all the world and make disciples. That's what Adam and Eve hear in Genesis 1. And now Abram's getting the same word. Go. Go. And what is he going to do? He's going to establish a house for himself that will be a house for the nations. So this is him fulfilling his plan. And then you've got name. The people of Babel were just trying to build a name for themselves. He says to Abram in Genesis 12, 1-3, I will make of you a great name. Okay? So he's resurrecting that name that Cain was trying to beat, that Lamech was trying to beat, that the people of Genesis 6 were trying to beat, that Babel was trying to beat, and Abram is God's maintaining that name among the nations. Okay? And of course, we see this most definitively in Jesus, who says, Father, glorify your name. And the Father responds, I have glorified it, and I will glorify it again. So Jesus is the one upholding the Father's name above everyone else. And that's why his name in Philippians 2, 5, and 11 is elevated above every other name. Amen? Okay, so we've got some contrasts at play here. Okay, What is the difference between Adam, Noah, and Abram? Are there any commonalities between these guys? And is there any difference between these guys? Anything that they remind you of each other? Exactly. Exactly. A starter of a new mission of God. Absolutely. Okay? That's the commonality between the three. Now I'm going to tell you that Adam and Noah have something in common, and Abram's the different one. Okay? All right. Do you want to ponder it a little bit before I jump in? Okay. Is Adam righteous when God gives him this commission? Yes. Is Noah righteous when God gives him this commission? Is Abram righteous when God gives him this commission? No. We don't learn till Joshua, but it says that Abram's father Nahor worshipped idols on the other side of the river. So Abram grew up in an idolatrous household. Or Terah, excuse me, not Nahor's his brother. Terah. So Abram's an idolater. He's not righteous. Okay? Another difference between Abram and Noah and Adam. Does Adam have any trouble having kids? Does Noah have any trouble having kids that you know about? Does Abram have trouble having kids? Okay, so this is the difference. Abram is a spiritual and physical dead end. He's hopeless. Now there's another difference between Adam and Noah and Abram. What does Adam get told by God? To fill the earth and multiply. What does Noah get told by God? Fill the earth and multiply. What does Abram get told by God? 5 times. I will. I will. I will. I will. Guys, huge difference. Abram gets told by God that God will do it. Adam gets told by God to do it. Noah gets told by God to do it. What is God trying to send? What message is God trying to send? Okay. Adam was sinless, and he couldn't do it. And the world might think, okay, well, that was Adam's problem, but we've got someone else that can do it. Noah's our man. He's the best there is. And what happens with Noah? He sinned. The first act of Noah is to build an altar on Mount Ararat. That's awesome. Then he plants a vineyard, which is like a garden. Then he takes the fruit of the vineyard and makes wine, gets drunk, exposes his nakedness, just like Adam imbibed of fruit and exposed his nakedness and had a son cursed. So Noah falls just like Adam. And so Adam was sinless and he failed. Noah was the best humanity had and he failed. And now there's Abram, who's spiritually dead, physically dead, as far as fruit. And God says, I'll do it, Abram. I'll be the one to do it. So this is an unconditional, I will get this done. I will get this done through you. This is the beauty of what happens with Abram, that it doesn't depend on Abram as it depends on God. That's the shift. Those are the contrasts. to find. Okay? All right. And if you think Abram was a physical dead end, just consider Jesus. He's born of a virgin. That's as hard as it gets. That's harder than being born from someone who's barren. Okay? He's born of a virgin. He's poor. He's single. He's homeless. And he had mostly everybody leave him at the end, and he gets crucified. So you think Abram's a dead end. Think of what people thought of Jesus. And God makes the whole world brand new through him. Or is in the process of. Okay, so this is a very notable difference between Abram and the two other starters of Noah and Adam. Okay? All right. Now, so God is going to do this, but it's not as though there's not a reliance of Abram, and if that reliance falters, he gets corrected, and God brings him back to that trust, because God wants to exalt his name through an image that truly represents him. So this is what he's doing with Abram, and he stresses the pain of it in chapter 12, verse 1. Look at how God stresses this. Go from your country. And tell me which direction God's moving. Okay? From in to out or out to in. Go from your country, your kindred, and your father's house to the land I will show you. Do you see how he narrows it in on Abram? Go from your country to your clan, your kin, to your father's house. So he's coming in a threefold section, and he'll ultimately make a threefold tabernacle out of Abram's descendants. Okay. So he promises to bless not just Abram, but the world through Abram. So he has a global thought in mind. And where do we see the globe being reached? Through Abram and his descendants. We see Abimelech making a treaty with Isaac. We see different world rulers make treaty with the patriarchs. They're being blessed by them. They see that God's presence is in them. A mixed multitude went up with Israel out of Egypt. Jethro, Moses' Midianite father-in-law, will come to see Yahweh as the one true God. Rahab, queen of Sheba, the Ninevites. Jeremiah will be rescued from the pit, not by an Israelite, but by an Ethiopian. That's your guys' namesake. Babylon's king Nebuchadnezzar will break and be made new under God's mighty hand. You've got Samaritans, you've got Syrophoenician, the centurion, and then the whole globe being reached. So God is always meant to reach the globe, and all of this starts in Genesis 1, but gets continued in Genesis 12. Okay, I've mentioned that Eden resurfaces through the oaks of Moreh. He goes into the hill country. You see that in Genesis 12:6 and 12:8. Moses will plant his tent by the tents of Moreh, or the oaks of Moreh, and then he'll go up into the hill country. All of these things are to remind you of Eden, that he is looking to replant Eden on planet Earth. Okay? Okay. And then a famine comes, and Pharaoh goes where? God just brought him into the land. He leaves, he goes into the land, and as soon as he gets there, a famine happens. What's he supposed to do? He goes to Egypt. Should he have done that? Is that a problem? Yes or no? Who thinks he should have went to Egypt? Is that a bad deal? Who thinks he shouldn't have went to Egypt? Shouldn't? Think he shouldn't? Okay. So some of my big heroes think it was totally fine for him to go to Egypt. I don't think he should have went to Egypt. Here are my narrative clues. The last word God had heard, or the last word Abraham had heard from God was to leave Haran. He didn't hear go to Egypt. When Isaac gets hit with a famine, God expressly says, do not go to Egypt. Okay? So I don't think he should have went to Egypt. He goes into Egypt. Sarah gets taken. He lies about Sarah being his sister. She's the one that's supposed to be giving the promised son, and now she's in another man's house. Is this a good thing? No. Now, why did Abram do what he did? Well, what we'll find is that brothers tend to negotiate for their sisters getting married. You see Laban do that even though Rebekah's dad, Bethuel, was still alive. So, but brothers do that. Simeon and Levi handle Dinah getting raped. They handle it wrongly, but they're still the ones that negotiate for their sister. All right, so brothers tend to negotiate. So Abram says, she's my sister, or he has Sarah say it. We find out he had her they negotiated that before they left Haran. So, because she's beautiful. So he goes and he lies about her being his sister, or she does. She's in Pharaoh's household. The promised son is in jeopardy now because she's about to get slept with by Pharaoh. Okay, so this seems to be bad. God keeps it from happening by putting plagues on Pharaoh's household, and then he comes to realize, and she's left, and they go back to where they stopped before. So it's like Abram builds an altar. I think he's in Bethel at this point. Shechem, Oaks of Moreh. So he's in Shechem. Oh yeah, and then he goes to the hill country east of Bethel to pitch his tent. So he's in Bethel, and you go up to Bethel, so it's a high place. So he goes down into Egypt. So anytime you're going down, it's like you're going into a state of death, which isn't good. So he's going into death. He leaves Bethel. He goes through this. He leaves with plagues. He comes back up. After going to Egypt, he comes back up to Bethel, where he was at the beginning. So it seems like he shouldn't have gone, okay? The other thing you learn is that when he goes into Egypt, what does he acquire there? He doesn't just acquire animals. He acquires people. Okay? What do we know about Hagar? What nationality is Hagar? She was an Egyptian. We learn in Genesis 16:1. So he probably got Hagar there. Okay? And so all of these things sort of point to the fact that Abram should not have gone down to Egypt. When Isaac is told expressly not to go to Egypt, God blesses him 100-fold where he's at. So, could God have kept Abram good in Bethel, or did he need to go? He could have kept him very well in Bethel. He could have done it. Now, it's not to say that there's not an Exodus pattern that's in place here. Because what do you have? When did Israel go to Egypt? When there was a famine. Pharaoh takes them into bondage. Who did he take into bondage? Sarah. God inflicts plagues on Pharaoh, just like he did Egypt. Pharaoh then says, take and go. That's the same thing that the Exodus Pharaoh will say to Israel, take and go. And then he leaves with plunder. So there is an Exodus pattern here, but I still don't think that puts Abram off the hook. That I think even in his imperfection, God blessed and gave Israel an Exodus pattern. And I think Israel could look back at this and say, if God took Abram out of Egypt, even though he was sinful, surely he can take us out of Egypt when we're just enslaved. Okay? So I think that's the greater picture developed here. Okay? So that is Genesis 12. Then we come into Genesis 13. You've got Abram and Lot experience a big amount of abundance. And then Alistair Roberts points out that the guiding phrase for this narrative is the phrase lift up. It said, you can't see it in your translations, but it says when the ground couldn't support them, it's meaning the ground couldn't lift them up. Okay? So the ground can't lift them up, so they have to separate because they got too much weight, so to speak. They got so many herds, all right? So the ground can't lift them up, and so they have to separate. Now, God has given Abram all this land. So he's got first pick. He's the one that the promises have been given to. But what does he say to Lot? Lot, lift up your eyes and choose the land that you want. Okay? Now, does Lot live by faith or by sight? He lives by sight because what does he choose? The Jordan Valley, which is like the Garden of Eden, it says. And you might think, oh, that's good. Lot's choosing something like the garden. No, he's living by sight because he's going down into the Jordan Valley. When people go down, it's not a good thing. Okay? So, Lot goes down. He lives by sight versus by faith. Think about it. He just experienced a famine. The Jordan Valley has a river, right? So, what is Lot thinking? I don't ever want to experience a famine again. That's what he's thinking. Okay? So he's living by sight. Abram is willing to stay where he was when the famine came and he had to leave. So Abram is willing to stay in the place that he just was in big trouble, famine-wise. So is Abram living by sight or by faith? By faith. He's saying, if God could get me out of Egypt the way he just did, he can take care of me in a famine. Okay? And we know that God's pleased with it because then God says, and this is the other time lift up comes in, God says to Abraham, you lift up your eyes and look as far as you can and walk around and I'll give you as far as your eye can see. It's beautiful. And this is a theme that will develop in the book of Genesis, that when people obey God, God heaps blessing and reassures promises. And it's us, when we act in faith, the assurance of our salvation gets boosted. When we sin, the assurance of our salvation shrivels up and dies, and we start doubting our salvation. That's exactly the way it's meant to be. John says, I write this in 1 John, so that when Jesus comes, you may approach him in confidence and not with shame. See? So, if someone's doubting their salvation, the best thing to ask them is, are you living in obedience to Jesus' commands? Because if you're not, in any way, shape, or form, if you're doing things you shouldn't do or not doing things you should do, the assurance of your salvation will go down, not up. And that's the way it's meant to be. You're grieving the Spirit. And you can even become callous to the Spirit. So this is the deal. Lot is living by sight, not by faith. And so then we begin Lot's progression, okay? And what you see is it starts out in Genesis 13:11. He journeyed east. And then in Genesis 13:12, he settled among the cities of the valley and moved his tent as far as Sodom. So he's moving, Genesis 13:11, 13:12. And then we'll read in Genesis 19:1 that he's sitting at the gate in Sodom. So there's a progression towards Sodom. It's happening not just like zoom, it's moving. It's moving there. That's what the narrator wants you to see. Okay? All right. And then God tells Abraham to look at the dust. And what you'll find to count your descendants, what you'll find is that God gives Abram a sign for the day to think of his descendants, and that's the dust. And then he'll give him a sign for the PM, for the night, to consider your descendants. And what is that? The stars. So whether day or night, Abraham can think about his descendants. Isn't that cool? Morning, day, and night. Abraham has a reference point to consider what's going on. Again, he's at the Oaks. He makes an altar there. This is all Eden imagery. And then you have Christ's temptation, which is similar, that Abram could have went to the Jordan Valley. Christ, Satan offers him all the kingdoms of the world, and Christ is waiting. And he's not interested. Okay? Just like Abram was waiting for the city of God, not Sodom. All right? He's of heaven, lots of earth. That's what we're to leave with so far. That Lot is going the way of the world. He's going down into the earth. Abram is up high with God. You see that?